August 16th, 1513. The plains near Guinegate, northern France. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon as 800 French heavy cavalry thundered toward the Anglo-Imperial lines. At their head rode Jacques de la Palisse, one of France's most experienced commanders, leading the cream of French nobility into what should have been a glorious charge. But something was wrong. Within minutes, these same French knights were spurring their horses away from battle, abandoning their standards, throwing off their armour, and fleeing across the countryside. Their desperate flight would give this engagement its name, the Battle of the Spurs. For young King Henry VIII of England, watching from the ridge above, this moment represented everything he had dreamed of since ascending the throne 4 years earlier. Here was his chance to prove himself a warrior king in the mould of Henry V, to win glory on the fields of France, and to announce Tudor England as a major European power. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Henry had staked his treasury, his reputation, and his kingdom's future on this campaign. At just 22 years old, he commanded the largest English army to cross the Channel since Agincourt. Around him stood seasoned imperial troops under Emperor Maximilian himself, who had agreed to serve as Henry's general in an extraordinary diplomatic arrangement. This is the story of the Battle of the Spurs, Henry VIII's first taste of military glory, and the campaign that established his credentials as a Renaissance prince. It's also the tale of medieval chivalry colliding with Renaissance pragmatism, of English determination overcoming French confidence, and of a young king's ambition transforming into diplomatic reality. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're exploring Henry VIII's French adventure of 1513, when an untested English king proved his worth on European battlefields and carved out England's place among the great powers. But before we witness that dramatic charge at Guinegate, before we see French knights fleeing in panic from English arrows, we need to understand how Henry VIII came to stake everything on this audacious invasion of France. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into Tudor military history, make sure to subscribe. We cover the campaigns where English kings demonstrated their martial prowess and strategic vision, the battles that built an empire through courage, determination, and superior tactics. The geopolitical situation in 1513 reflected the complex web of alliances that characterised early 16th century Europe. When Henry VIII ascended the English throne in 1509, he inherited a full treasury from his prudent father Henry VII, but also a kingdom that had remained largely isolated from continental affairs. The young king's ambitions were entirely different from his father's cautious approach. Henry dreamed of reviving England's medieval claims to French territory. He saw himself as the rightful heir to Henry V's legacy, destined to win glory on French battlefields and restore English influence in Europe. These weren't mere youthful fantasies. They represented a fundamental shift in English foreign policy, from defensive isolation to aggressive intervention. The catalyst for Henry's ambitions came through the machinations of Pope Julius II, who was determined to break French power in Italy. In 1511, Julius formed the Holy League, bringing together the Papal States, Spain, Venice, the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually England against France. For Henry, this provided the perfect justification for war, a holy war against French aggression that would bring both religious legitimacy and territorial gain. Henry's entry into the Holy League through the Westminster Treaty of November 1511 committed England to active military intervention. But the English king demanded more than a supporting role. He insisted on leading major operations himself, despite having no military experience beyond tournament fighting and theoretical study of warfare. The first English expedition to France in 1512 had been a catastrophic failure. Henry's forces, sent to Gascony in support of his father-in-law, Ferdinand of Aragon, achieved nothing while suffering massive casualties from disease. Over 3,000 English soldiers died from dysentery and typhus without fighting a single major engagement. The survivors mutinied and sailed home, leaving Henry humiliated and Ferdinand pursuing his own agenda in Navarre. This disaster only strengthened Henry's determination to lead personally in 1513. he would not repeat the mistakes of the previous year. This time he would command the expedition himself, ensure proper supplies and organisation, and coordinate closely with his imperial allies to achieve decisive results. The scale of Henry's 1513 expedition was unprecedented for an English overseas deployment. Thomas Wolsey, Henry's brilliant administrator, organised the logistics for transporting nearly 30,000 men across the Channel, the largest English army to campaign in France since Henry V's Agincourt expedition a century earlier. The army reflected the military revolution transforming European warfare. Traditional heavy cavalry and longbowmen fought alongside modern artillery and disciplined infantry formations. Henry brought one of Europe's most advanced siege trains, including massive cannons capable of reducing medieval fortifications to rubble in days rather than months. The king's personal retinue epitomised Renaissance magnificence. Henry wore specially commissioned golden armour that cost more than most nobles' annual incomes. His pavilions were decorated with cloth of gold and furnished with luxury items designed to impress both allies and enemies. This wasn't mere vanity. It was calculated propaganda, demonstrating England's wealth and the king's commitment to matching Europe's greatest monarchs in both splendour and military capability. Emperor Maximilian's participation added crucial credibility to the enterprise. The Holy Roman Emperor agreed to serve nominally as Henry's general, providing experienced leadership while allowing the English king to claim overall command. This arrangement suited both rulers. Henry gained military expertise and imperial prestige, while Maximilian received substantial English subsidies for his perpetually empty treasury. The expedition landed at Calais in late June 1513 and immediately demonstrated the efficiency of Wolsey's planning. Unlike the previous year's chaos, supplies flowed smoothly from England to the front lines. English and imperial forces coordinated effectively, with Maximilian's veterans providing tactical guidance to Henry's enthusiastic but inexperienced army. The first major objective was Terouanne, a French-held fortress in Artois that threatened imperial territories. The choice of target reflected sound strategic thinking. Terouanne's elimination would secure the frontier and provide a manageable test of the Allied army's capabilities before attempting larger operations. The siege of Terouanne showcased the revolution in military technology that was transforming European warfare. Henry's artillery train included some of the most advanced cannons in Europe, capable of breaching medieval walls that had withstood conventional attacks for centuries. The English gunners quickly established their reputation for accuracy and devastating firepower. French resistance proved stubborn, but ultimately futile against sustained bombardment. The garrison under Antoine de Crequy attempted innovative defensive measures, including fire trenches designed to blind attackers with smoke, but these expedients could not compensate for the fundamental obsolescence of medieval fortifications against Renaissance artillery. The siege's progress was interrupted by French attempts to resupply the fortress. Captain Fontaret led 800 Albanian cavalry in a daring raid that successfully penetrated the Allied siege lines and delivered crucial supplies to the defenders. This success prolonged the siege, but also set the stage for the climactic battle that would define the campaign. French strategy aimed to relieve Terouanne through a coordinated assault that would force the Allies to abandon the siege. King Louis XIV dispatched a substantial cavalry force under Jacques de la Palisse, with orders to break through to the fortress, while the main French army advanced to support the operation. The plan initially showed promise. La Palisse's force included the elite of French heavy cavalry, knights whose families had fought at Agincourt and whose martial reputation was respected throughout Europe. Their mission was straightforward: punch through the Allied lines, link up with the garrison, and hold the position until the main French army arrived. But La Palisse's force faced an opponent that combined English tactical innovation with imperial military experience. Henry's army had positioned itself to control all approaches to Terouanne, while maintaining the flexibility to respond rapidly to French moves. When scouts reported the approaching French cavalry, the Allies were ready. August 16th dawned clear and hot as French cavalry approached the Allied positions. La Palisse commanded approximately 800 heavy cavalry, a substantial force capable of decisive impact if properly employed. These were not raw recruits, but experienced knights and men-at-arms who had campaigned across Europe and knew their business. The French plan was aggressive but conventional. La Palisse would lead a direct charge designed to scatter Allied opposition through shock and momentum. Once through the lines, his cavalry would establish a corridor for supplies and reinforcements while threatening the siege works from the rear. Henry's response demonstrated the military lessons he had absorbed during months of campaigning alongside Maximilian. Rather than meeting the French charge directly, the Allies positioned their forces to channel the attack into a killing zone where superior numbers and coordinated tactics would neutralise French advantages. The English contribution to this tactical solution reflected their traditional military strengths adapted for continental warfare. Longbowmen took positions behind protective obstacles where they could deliver flanking fire against charging cavalry. Infantry formations provided solid anchors for the defensive line while maintaining the flexibility to pursue broken enemies. Imperial cavalry under Maximilian's direct command formed the mobile reserve. These experienced troopers understood how to coordinate with English infantry and archers, having practiced such cooperation during the siege operations. Their role would be to exploit French disorder once the initial charge was broken. When the French cavalry came within range, the battle's outcome was decided in minutes. La Palisse's knights encountered not a static defensive line, but a sophisticated tactical system designed to defeat cavalry attacks through combined arms coordination. English arrows struck the charging French from unexpected angles as longbowmen exploited positions La Palisse had not detected. The French formation, compressed by the terrain into a narrow front, could not deploy effectively against multiple threats. Individual courage could not overcome systemic tactical disadvantages. As French momentum died under sustained missile fire, Imperial cavalry struck the flanks of the stalled charge. La Palisse's knights found themselves surrounded and facing overwhelming numbers with no room to maneuver. The disciplined charge dissolved into individual fights for survival. Recognizing the hopelessness of his position, La Palisse ordered a general withdrawal, but by this point his formation had disintegrated beyond effective command and control. What began as an organised retreat became a rout as individual French knights fled for their lives. The pursuit that followed gave the battle its distinctive character. French knights, accustomed to fighting in heavy armour, found themselves at a fatal disadvantage when speed became essential for survival. Many threw away helmets, weapons, and even armour in desperate attempts to outdistance their pursuers. English and Imperial cavalry maintained relentless pressure throughout the chase. The flat terrain around Guinegate provided no natural obstacles where the French could rally or make a stand. For miles across the countryside, scattered groups of French knights spurred exhausted horses toward distant safety. The image of French knights using their spurs more than their swords gave the engagement its enduring name. Contemporary observers, particularly English chroniclers, seized upon this detail as evidence of French cowardice and English valour. The propaganda value was enormous. Here was proof that English arms could humble the pride of French chivalry. Among the most celebrated prisoners taken during the rout was Pierre Terray, the Chevalier Bayard, renowned throughout Europe as the perfect embodiment of chivalrous virtue. Bayard's capture and subsequent release illustrated the complex relationship between medieval honour codes and Renaissance political calculation. When surrounded near a bridge, Bayard noticed an English knight sleeping under a tree. In a display of characteristic wit, Bayard woke the man by placing his sword at his throat, formally surrendering to him, then immediately accepted the startled Englishman's surrender in return. This created a legal paradox that amused Henry when brought to his attention. Henry's response to Bayard revealed both his chivalrous education and his political acumen. Rather than demand ransom for such a prestigious prisoner, Henry released Bayard without payment, earning enormous prestige for his magnanimity. The gesture also served practical purposes, demonstrating that English kings could match European standards of noble behaviour. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of the Spurs justified Henry's strategic gamble. French morale collapsed as news of the defeat spread throughout the kingdom. The garrison of Terouanne, deprived of hope for relief, surrendered on August 22nd after a brief final bombardment. Henry's entry into the captured fortress provided the theatrical culmination he had sought throughout the campaign. The formal surrender of the town keys, conducted with elaborate ceremony, gave the young king his first taste of conquest on French soil. For contemporary observers, this moment represented England's return to its rightful place among Europe's military powers. The destruction of Terouanne reflected the campaign's broader strategic objectives. Rather than garrison the fortress, the Allies demolished its walls and filled in its ditches, eliminating forever a French strongpoint that had threatened imperial territories. This systematic destruction sent a clear message about the consequences of opposing the English-Imperial alliance. The success at Terouanne enabled an even more ambitious undertaking, the siege of Tournai, one of the wealthiest cities in the Low Countries. This operation would test whether Henry's army could capture a major urban centre as effectively as it had reduced a frontier fortress. Tournai's siege lasted only 8 days, from September 15th to September 23rd. The city's rapid surrender demonstrated the psychological impact of Henry's artillery and the demoralisation caused by French defeats. Contemporary observers marvelled at the speed with which medieval walls crumbled before Renaissance firepower. Henry's triumphant entry into Tournai provided even greater satisfaction than his success at Terouanne. Here was a genuine prize, a wealthy commercial centre that could serve as a permanent English base in the Low Countries. The king immediately began treating Tournai as English territory, appointing governors and planning fortifications. The construction of Henry VIII Tower in Tournai represented the king's determination to make his conquest permanent. This massive circular keep, with walls 7 metres thick, was designed to dominate the city and serve as a symbol of English power. Though built in traditional style rather than the latest Italian designs, the tower's enormous scale intimidated potential rebels and impressed visitors. While Henry celebrated his victories in France, an even more significant triumph was unfolding on England's northern frontier. The ancient alliance between Scotland and France had drawn King James IV of Scotland into the war, leading to a massive Scottish invasion of England in September 1513. The Battle of Flodden, fought on September 9th, became one of the most decisive encounters in Anglo-Scottish history. Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, commanding English forces in Henry's absence, inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the invading Scots. King James IV died on the battlefield alongside much of Scotland's nobility and over 10,000 soldiers. Queen Catherine of Aragon, serving as regent in Henry's absence, wrote to her husband with news of the victory and sent him James IV's blood-stained coat as a trophy. This gesture symbolised the completeness of English triumph on both fronts and the successful coordination of England's defensive capabilities. The dual victories in France and Scotland represented a watershed moment in English history. Henry VIII had simultaneously defeated the kingdom's traditional enemies and demonstrated England's capacity for major military operations. These successes established his credentials as both a warrior king and a competent strategist. The diplomatic consequences of Henry's victories extended far beyond the immediate military gains. European courts that had previously dismissed England as a peripheral kingdom were forced to reassess English capabilities and ambitions. Henry had successfully demonstrated that England could coordinate effectively with continental partners and achieve decisive results. However, the campaign's diplomatic success was undermined by the volatile nature of Renaissance politics. Ferdinand of Aragon and Emperor Maximilian concluded separate peace agreements with France in 1514 without consulting their English partner. These betrayals left Henry diplomatically isolated despite his military triumphs. Henry's response demonstrated his growing political sophistication. Rather than continue a hopeless struggle alone, he negotiated his own peace settlement that secured English interests. The Treaty of 1514 included provisions for Henry's sister Mary to marry the ageing French king Louis XIV, cementing the new diplomatic arrangement. The financial cost of the 1513 campaign was enormous, consuming much of Henry VII's accumulated treasury surplus. This expenditure forced significant changes in English fiscal policy but the political benefits justified the investment. Henry had achieved his primary objective of establishing England as a serious European power. The cultural impact of the Battle of the Spurs extended far beyond politics. Henry commissioned numerous artistic works to commemorate his triumph, including paintings that depicted him as the epitome of Renaissance kingship. The Royal Collection painting showing Henry at the battle became one of the most iconic images of Tudor monarchy. The long-term military lessons influenced English tactical development for decades. The campaign demonstrated the continued effectiveness of English archery when properly coordinated with other arms, while highlighting the growing importance of artillery and professional infantry. These insights shaped English military thinking throughout Henry's reign. Most importantly, the Battle of the Spurs gave Henry VIII the military credibility he needed for his later ambitions. The young king, who had proved himself on French battlefields, could credibly challenge established powers and demand recognition as an equal among European monarchs. If this kind of military history appeals to you, campaigns where English determination and tactical innovation overcame seemingly superior enemies, battles where personal courage combined with strategic vision to achieve lasting victory, conflicts that elevated England from a peripheral kingdom to a major European power, then you know what to do. These are the stories that built an empire through martial excellence. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the battles and campaigns where English courage and tactical brilliance established our nation as a great power, told with the drama and detail they deserve.